Okay, so imagine this. You're just going about your day, and then, bam, you lose your job, your bank account's frozen, your passport's gone, and to top it all off, you're slapped with the label terrorist.
Wow.
And all this without a trial, no evidence, no nothing. Sounds pretty unbelievable, right? Well, that's the reality for tens of thousands of people in Turkey.
Likely.
Yeah, it's because of these government decrees called KHKMC, and that's exactly what we're diving deep into today. Human rights in Turkey. We've got this powerful document, a joint submission to the UN from 3 human rights organizations. It's like a legal and moral indictment, laying out systemic violations against these KHK victims.
It is fascinating. We often talk about human rights in a broad sense, but this really zooms in on a specific group and their experiences. It's like through their stories, we uncover this much larger problem.
Yeah, and this isn't just another news story. This deep dive shows how quickly things can change, how the rule of law can just erode, even in a country many consider a democracy.
It's a stark reminder for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's break it down. The report takes us back to 2016, right after that failed coup attempt in Turkey.
Right. The government declared a state of emergency and started issuing these KHKs, these decrees.
Yeah.
They were supposed to be temporary measures to restore order, security.
Yeah. Temporary measures.
Right.
But here's where things take a turn. The report argues that these KHKs were basically weaponized. They weren't about security anymore. They became a tool to eliminate anyone who disagreed with the government.
Basically to consolidate power.
Exactly. The report uses this chilling phrase to describe what's happening, the construction of a single-party authoritarian state.
And it's important to understand that the KHK victims, they aren't a single homogenous group. We're talking teachers, doctors, judges, academics, people from all walks of life.
It's not like they all belong to some organization or something.
No, their common thread is that they were perceived as opponents of the current government.
One example that really stuck with me was this judge known for being impartial fair, suddenly labeled a terrorist and thrown in jail. Yeah, it just shows how arbitrary and unjust these KHKs are.
It's a complete disregard for due process.
Absolutely. And that's just one story. There are thousands more. The report meticulously documents so many human rights violations, things that go way beyond what's been reported in previous UN reviews.
So let's dive into some of those violations.
Yeah, we'll go through all 35, but we'll focus on the ones that are the most impactful and shocking, the ones that really grabbed us.
Okay, one of the most fundamental principles of any justice system is the presumption of innocence, right? Innocent until proven guilty.
Makes sense.
But with these KHK victims, that principle was completely disregarded.
So you're saying they're declared guilty without any evidence and then expected to prove their innocence?
Yeah, it's completely backwards. And this disregard for due process has led to mass arbitrary arrests, detentions. The report talks about people being dragged from their homes in the middle of the night without even knowing what they're being accused of.
That's terrifying.
It is. And it doesn't stop there. The report details horrific accounts of torture, degrading treatment, victims subjected to physical and psychological abuse during interrogations.
We read about one teacher who was detained, and she described being forced to stand for hours sleep-deprived and threatened with harm to her family if she didn't confess to crimes she didn't commit.
It's just chilling.
Yeah, and these violations go beyond just the individual. They impact families in devastating ways.
Yeah, the report shares stories of children being separated from their parents' families, struggling to survive after the breadwinner is unjustly dismissed. It's really tragic.
The ripple effects are huge. The report also mentions these extraordinary courts. What are they and why are they significant?
Well, these courts were set up specifically to handle KHK cases. The problem is they lack true independence and they're heavily biased against the victims.
So even the supposed path to justice is rigged against them.
Basically, yeah. It makes it almost impossible for them to get a fair hearing.
It's a bleak picture for sure. But the report doesn't just highlight the problems, right? There are some solutions offered as well.
Absolutely. The report outlines several key recommendations for the Turkish government. It calls for immediate reinstatement of all KHK victims to their positions. So reversing those unjust dismissals and restoring their livelihoods.
Makes sense. But what about all the damage that's been done? Years of lost income, emotional distress, the impact on their families.
That's addressed too. The report demands full compensation for all losses as a result of the KHK's back pay, benefits, everything.
Okay, so reinstatement and compensation, those are crucial. But what about preventing this from happening again? Are there any recommendations for long-term change?
Yeah, the report emphasizes the need for legal reforms to address the root causes of these violations. Specifically, it calls for the annulment of all KHK decrees, the ones that allowed for these injustices in the first place.
Like hitting the reset button on those problematic laws.
Exactly. And they also recommend establishing independent and impartial judicial bodies to review all KHK cases, a system of checks and balances to make sure justice is actually served.
Which is desperately needed, given what we've heard about the current courts. And, of course, we can't forget the human side of all of this. So many people have been traumatized by these experiences.
Absolutely. The report calls for comprehensive psychosocial support and rehabilitation programs for victims and their families, recognizing the deep emotional scars left by these events.
So it's clear these KHK decrees have had a devastating and far-reaching impact on Turkish society. And there's even more to uncover. The report also delves into several previously unreported violations, highlighting how these decrees have created a climate of fear and repression that affects everyone in Turkey.
Yeah, and that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of this deep dive. We'll examine how these decrees have impacted freedom of movement, property rights, and even the right to health for countless individuals and families.
Stay tuned. There's a lot more to unpack. Welcome back to our deep dive into human rights in Turkey. If you're just tuning in, we're really digging into this UN report that exposes the impact of these government decrees, these KHKs.
Yeah, in the last part, we focused on those individual stories of KHK victims. Now we're going to go deeper into the report's findings about some previously unreported human rights violations.
So we're moving beyond the individual cases.
Exactly. It's about seeing how these KHK decrees have created this climate of fear that impacts everyone in Turkey, not just those directly targeted.
One thing that really struck me in this report is this concept of collective punishment. We know that the KHKs targeted specific people, but how does collective punishment play into all this?
Well, imagine this, a family, let's say the father is a teacher. He gets dismissed from his job under a KHK decree.
Okay, a familiar story, unfortunately.
But it doesn't end there. The report shows that his whole family is now ostracized, they're denied access to public services, they even face harassment.
Wow, all because of something he supposedly did.
Exactly, guilty by association. And this collective punishment, it extends to so many aspects of life. For example, restriction on freedom of movement.
Right, we take for granted being able to travel.
But KHK victims have had their passports revoked for no reason.
I can't even imagine the feeling of being trapped like that.
Yeah, it's a clear violation of a basic human right. And it's not just about vacations. The report mentions people being barred from seeking medical treatment abroad, or even reuniting with family members who live in other countries.
There's a story in the report about a university professor who was dismissed under a KHK. He needed this life-saving medical procedure that wasn't available in Turkey, but he wasn't allowed to travel for treatment.
Oh, wow.
He ended up passing away because of these restrictions. It's heartbreaking.
That's awful. And on top of that, the report also uncovers these widespread violations of property rights.
This one really surprised me. What's going on with property rights?
Well, in some cases, the government just straight up confiscated property belonging to KHK victims. Yeah. But in other cases, it's more subtle. The report found that people who had donated their property to charity, with the understanding that the transfer would happen after their death, they're now being forced to either leave their homes or pay rent while they're still alive.
So they're being punished for their generosity.
It's crazy, right? And it's important to remember that these violations of property rights, just like the restrictions on freedom of movement and the collective punishment of families, it creates this chilling effect on everyone.
Yeah, it makes people afraid to speak out or do anything that might be seen as critical of the government.
Exactly. And then there's the violation of the right to Social Security.
I was wondering about that. We know many KHK victims lost their jobs, but what happened to their Social Security benefits? Shouldn't that be a safety net?
You would think so, right? But the report found that KHK victims were systematically denied access to those benefits. So they lose their livelihood, and then they're denied the very support that's supposed to help them.
It's like a double punishment.
It is. And it gets worse. The report actually found that the Social Security system was used against them. When KHK victims tried to find new jobs, the system flagged them to potential employers.
So they were blacklisted, basically.
Exactly, blocked from getting back on their feet. And the consequences go beyond financial hardship. The report also documents this devastating impact on health and well-being.
Yeah, we talked about being denied travel for medical care, but the report also highlighted how many people lost their health insurance when they lost their jobs.
Right, leaving them unable to afford even basic care. There are stories of people with chronic illnesses forced to stop treatment because they couldn't afford it, leading to a deterioration of their health.
And of course, we can't forget the mental and emotional toll.
Absolutely. The report found incredibly high rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD among KHK victims. It's a direct result of the trauma and stress they've been through.
It's clear that these KHK decrees have had this massive impact on Turkish society.
It's really alarming. And what's even more concerning is that, according to the report, these violations, they aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a systematic effort to silence any kind of dissent and consolidate power.
So what can be done? What hope is there for these victims? Is there any way to address these injustices?
That's the big question. And it's exactly what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at the report's recommendations for action and see if there's a path towards justice.
Okay, so stay with us. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've spent this episode looking at human rights in Turkey and the devastating impact of those government decrees, the KHKs.
It's been heavy stuff for sure, but it's so important to understand what's happening and how it's affecting people's lives.
Yeah, we've uncovered some really shocking information about just how widespread these violations are and how they're affecting not just individuals, but their families and even society as a whole.
It's a systemic issue. But now let's shift gears a bit and talk about solutions. The report doesn't just lay out the problems. It offers some potential paths forward, some ways to address these injustices.
Right, it's about action and hope.
Exactly. So what does the report recommend? Where do we even begin to tackle something this big?
Well, the recommendations are really comprehensive. They target both the immediate needs of the KHK victims and the systemic issues that allowed these violations to happen. It's about helping people now and preventing this from happening again.
Okay, so two-pronged approach. So what are some of the most urgent things that need to happen?
The most urgent recommendation is the immediate reinstatement of all KHK victims to their positions.
So basically reversing those unjust dismissals and giving people back their livelihood.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the harm that's been done and taking steps to right the wrong.
And of course, there's the financial side of things too.
Right. Alongside getting their jobs back, the report also calls for full compensation for all the losses people have experienced because of the KHK's back pay benefits, any financial hardship they've suffered.
So making things right as much as possible and helping people get back on their feet. But what about preventing this from happening again? Are there recommendations for more long-term change?
Absolutely. The report goes beyond just immediate relief. It calls for legal reforms to address the root causes of these violations. Specifically, they recommend annulling all the KHK decrees that were used to violate human rights.
So getting rid of the laws that allowed this to happen in the first place.
Yeah, like hitting the reset button on those problematic laws.
It's a big step, a total system overhaul. But we've heard how the current system is biased against KHK victims. How can we be sure that things will actually change, that justice will be served?
That's a valid concern. That's why the report also recommends setting up independent and impartial judicial bodies to review all the KHK cases.
So creating a system that's actually fair and where people have a real chance to be heard.
Exactly. It's about checks and balances.
And of course, we can't forget about accountability. Someone needs to be held responsible for what's happened.
Absolutely. The report stresses the need for thorough and independent investigations into all those allegations of human rights abuses related to the KHKs.
Not just about punishing individuals, but uncovering the truth and making sure that those in power are held responsible.
Right. It's about justice and transparency.
We also have to remember the human cost of all this. So many people have been traumatized by these experiences. Their lives have been completely upended.
The report addresses that too. It recommends these comprehensive psychosocial support and rehabilitation programs for victims and their families.
So it's not just about legal remedies, but also about providing counseling therapy and resources to help people heal and rebuild their lives.
Exactly, recognizing the emotional scars these violations have left.
This report has been really eye-opening, but it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, to feel helpless in the face of such injustice. So what can we as individuals do to help? What can we do to make a difference?
That's a great question, one the report directly addresses. It calls on the international community to hold the Turkish government accountable for these violations.
So it's about raising awareness, speaking out, and putting pressure on those in power to change.
Exactly. The report specifically urges international organizations, foreign governments, and human rights groups to monitor the situation, closely condemn the abuses, and offer support to the victims.
So using our voices and our collective power to push for change.
Right. And there's also the aspect of humanitarian assistance providing support to those who have been affected by the KHKs.
It sounds like there's a lot of work to be done, but it's encouraging to see that there are people fighting back, demanding justice, and calling for change.
It is, but we have to be realistic too. The report acknowledges that the road to justice is going to be long and difficult. They estimate it could take 18 to 20 years for victims to go through all the legal processes and potentially receive some form of redress.
Wow, 18 to 20 years.
Hmm.
That's a long time to wait for justice. I can't imagine what these victims are going through living in limbo for so long. Will justice even be meaningful after all that?
It's a tough question to answer, a question we have to grapple with. But even as we acknowledge the challenges, it's vital to remember that the fight for justice can't stop. We can't allow these violations to fade into the background or be swept under the rug. We have to keep talking about them, keep raising awareness, and keep pushing for change.
It's about persistence and solidarity. And that brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. What can you do? How can you help raise awareness about this issue? How can we collectively make sure that these voices are heard and that justice is served? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We know it's been a heavy topic, but we hope this episode has sparked your curiosity and maybe even inspired you to take action. Because when it comes to human rights, silence is not an option.